Hey listeners, welcome back to another episode on 8-Bit Talk, your go-to podcast for all things STEAM with a creative twist. I'm Looth, and today alongside with my co-hosts Zak and Yafi, we're thrilled to have a very special guest joining us. She's a young author who made waves in the world of literature with her debut poetry book, Musings of a Young Girl. Please welcome Kia Aisha Sinan. Kia, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us today. Your book has been a topic of much excitement amongst our listeners. Could you start by telling us a bit about Musings of a Young Girl and what inspired you to write about it?
Thank you, Looth, Zak, and Yafi for having me. I released Musings of a Young Girl in 2022 when I was still exploring myself creatively, experimenting with styles and forms. Since then, I've written much more, as one would expect. Despite that, Musings is the project I remain proudest of. It was certainly not as literally complex as, for example, the poetry anthology I released in December, titled All the Precious. Musings is messy, raw, and personal. Often, I thought, too raw and too personal. It was inspired by a multitude of sources, but primarily by my own desire to create something of aesthetic and personal value.
That's fascinating, Kia. Many of our listeners are young creators themselves. Can you share a bit about your journey learning to write? How did you develop your writing skills?
Absolutely. To be perfectly transparent, I've been writing as long as I can remember. I have no recollection of a time where I haven't been. Intrinsically, writing is a part of who I am. It is my existence. I can attribute it partly, though, to reading. If one wants to be a good writer, they must be a good reader. Even now, I read everything I can get my hands on, classics and contemporaries alike. It's certainly a process, and it comes with practice and with patience.
It sounds like a supportive community played a big role in your development. Speaking of support, publishing a book is a huge step. How did you navigate the publishing process? And what advice would you have for young writers looking to publish their works?
Yes, definitely. I've been incredibly fortunate to have the undying support of my family, friends, and followers. Navigating the publishing world was certainly a challenge in its own right. I never planned to traditionally publish any of my works, as it means having to give up creative control, something I value greatly as an artist. Initially, I self-published Musings using Amazon, but decided one day on a whim to query a publishing house. Just one. The acceptance email came in around a month later, and I was at a complete loss. Naturally, my journey looks significantly different than other authors, so it is difficult to generalize a piece of advice to give. If I had to, however, I would tell every young writer to understand that the story that they aim to tell is of importance, and that nothing should deter them from thinking that.
That's solid advice, Kia. And on that note, our listeners who are budding scientists, engineers, artists, and mathematicians often look for guidance. What advice do you have for young people, regardless of their field, about pursuing their passions?
As Oscar Wilde famously said, to define is to limit. Never be fearful to cross boundaries in the name of what you love, and never let your love for one thing prevent you from loving another. Stay curious. Failure is not really necessary, it is inevitable, though I prefer to think of it as a learning opportunity. Take calculated risks, know your worth, and don't compromise your integrity, no matter what.
Before we wrap this up, Kia, can you share a bit about your future plans? Any upcoming projects for our listeners should be excited about?
I'm currently working on my fourth book, a collection of poetry and short stories that I hope to release this year. I'm immensely proud of the progress I've made on it and cannot wait to share it with the world. In other news, I recently released All the Precious, my second poetry anthology, in December, and it is available to read for free on my website. Much like Musings, it is a collection of hopes and dreams, though I find that I am now much more able to adequately express the thoughts that riddle me.
Your poem, The Anatomy of a Poet, is a compelling exploration of what it means to be a poet. You mentioned the idea of poets being beautiful liars and the complexity beneath the facade. Could you expand on what inspired this viewpoint and how you see the role of truth and fabrication in poetry?
Well, that is a wonderful question. The idea of being beautiful liars as a poet was one that had stayed with me for weeks. It was an initial contemplation of the duality inherent in the poet's craft. Poetry, at its essence, is a form of artistic expression that allows us creators to distill the most complex emotions into the simplest words. Truth and fabrication in art has always been nuanced. When I write, I always draw from personal experience, but I have a tendency to imbue those truths with symbolic elements to ensure my readers understand my profoundly human condition.
That sounds incredible, Kia. We can't wait to see all the amazing things you'll accomplish. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your journey and insights. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in to another episode of 8-Bit Talk. We hope Kia's story has inspired you to pursue your own creative passions. Don't forget to check out Musings of a Young Girl and support young authors like Kia. Until next time, keep exploring, creating, and learning. Stay curious.